Good afternoon, everyone. You can hear me, right? Good to see you all. Welcome on this hot day. It's a good place to stay a little cooler. My name is Carole Genshaft. I'm the curator at large here at the Columbus Museum of Art. And it's been my privilege to work with our chief curator emeritus, David Stark, and our colleagues from the Old Masters Picture Gallery in Dresden on this wonderful exhibition, Raphael, The Power of Renaissance Images, the Dresden Tapestries and Their Impact. And what I hoped, well, before we start, I did want to point out that there's a wonderful catalog that accompanies the exhibition and is available in the shop. It's quite beautiful, and it's just full of great information. And if you have any questions, it's a great place to go. Also, there's other programs that are related to the exhibition, and you can just go to our website and find out more about those. And what I plan to do today is talk about the work that's related to Raphael's work. But before I do that, I'm going to do well, let me ask you this. How many of you have seen the exhibition? So most of you. And how many of you were here last week for David Stark's talk? Okay, good. I hope it's not too, I think they overlap, but hopefully they go a little different directions. So what I hope to do is talk about the work that's related to Raphael's work. But before I do that, I'm going to do just a quick summation of some important points about the tapestries and just a quick overview of Raphael's life. So that's my plan. If I get this part right. Oops. There we go. So artistic training in the Renaissance involved drawing or copying from nature, from antique sculptures, and from the work of other acclaimed artists. While Raphael was painting for the popes, skilled printmakers such as Marcantonio Raimondi were widely disseminating the master's compositions through the relatively new medium of engraving. Some of these printmakers and painters aimed to learn from the masters by making their copies as exact as the originals as possible. Others were inspired to make their own innovations based on the work of masters. The goal of this presentation is to highlight examples in the exhibition of engravings made by contemporaneous printmakers who worked closely with Raphael, and prints and paintings of artists through the generations since who found inspiration in Raphael's art, especially in the Acts of the Apostles tapestries and the drawings and cartoons on which they are based. So to begin with, just generally speaking, the tapestry on your left is just done a few years before those of Raphael. And I can't really see you to ask this, but I'm sure you can tell the difference between them. The medieval and the earlier Renaissance tapestries were really very pattern intensive, covered the whole surface. And Raphael's really marked a great departure from this earlier kind of tapestry development. And so you see in Raphael's work, it's very painterly. He's creating the illusion of space by having a background. The figures are life-size, they interact with one another. He felt no urgency to fill up every space. And just, from very first sight, they look a lot different than those earlier tapestries that you may be familiar with. And then Raphael himself, just a few notes. He was born in 1483 in Urbino in Italy. His father was an artist who trained him, but unfortunately his father passed away when he was about 8 years old. But by the time he was a teenager, he was already acknowledged as someone with lots of talent and potential. He went to work in Florence for a few years. And then when he was around 25, he went to Rome, and he did paintings for Pope Julius II. Upon Julius II's death, Pope Leo became his great patron. And Raphael also established a workshop in Rome. We'll hear more about that. It was pretty unusual at the time, and at its peak had maybe 40 or 50 artists working with him. He became architect of St. Peter's. He had worked with the architect Bramante, and when he passed away, Raphael became the architect of St. Peter's. And in 1515, he was appointed the supervisor of antiquities. We'll see how that really is important in his work as well. And then in 1515, Pope Leo commissioned the tapestries for the Sistine Chapel. And not long after Raphael dies at age 37 in 1520. And, I always think we just did the Van Gogh exhibition, and Van Gogh, too, only lived to be 37. And of course, Van Gogh has been so influential in the generation since. And he shares that with Raphael. But Raphael, during his lifetime, was a superstar. He was generally loved by people. He was emulated. His style was appreciated. He was greatly respected. He was a good businessman. He also had a wonderful love life, it seems, unlike Van Gogh. So a lot of differences, but he was really someone who was well known during his lifetime as well as in the generations to come. And of course, the tapestries really start with these wonderful drawings. Raphael did over 400 drawings, but only about 14 that have to do with the Acts of the Apostles survive. And there might be more, but that's all that have been identified. And we're very fortunate to have 2 of those in the exhibition upstairs. The first is this little, let's see, yeah, the one right up here, the 8 Apostles. So, I think you can feel kind of the close to Raphael through these drawings. He had this huge workshop that I mentioned, so we don't know exactly what hand he had in some of the major paintings and so forth, but we know he did a lot of these preliminary drawings. We also know, and it's so interesting, that that the Apostles was part of a bigger scene, and the only 2 parts that survive, it was then cut up, and the only 2 parts that survive are this one that's in the Louvre and this one from the National Gallery that's upstairs. And the reason we know this is because what Raphael would have his studio do is, after he did these drawings, he'd have them create a print, what he called an offset, because as we know, when the weavers wove the tapestries, they turned out to be and they wove from the back, they turned out to be the mirror image of the cartoons or the paintings of which were serving as templates. So this is actually the offset, and that's how we know that these 2 pieces were together. But then you see where he got the idea for Christ's charge to Peter and this lineup of apostles. What's also interesting is that he used for models the people in his workshop, and they're usually wearing clothes that they wore during the Renaissance to work. And that's what you see here. And later on, he'd fill in with the robes and with facial features, beards and hats, etc. This is the other drawing that's in the exhibition. This is from the Albertina in Vienna. And this one's interesting too, because you can see that he was working out ideas, and it has elements of 2 of the tapestries, both Miraculous Draft of the Fishes and Christ's Charge to Peter. So you see that at some point he was kind of putting these 2 ideas together, because this is the part that we see in Christ's Charge to Peter. And then, of course, you see the boat that ends up being in the Miraculous Draft of the Fishes. So it's kind of a combination. And you see there was a sail at some point, which has been eliminated in the cartoon and then subsequently in the tapestry. So after he would do these drawings, at some point he ended up with a modella, which was a smaller painting of the final composition. And then he would have the people in his workshop put together little pieces of paper, because they couldn't make big pieces of paper. So it's very time consuming. And there were lots and lots of little pieces of paper put together, as many as 200, attached to the wall. And then by way of a ladder or scaffolding, members of this workshop would do a chalk outline of the drawing, and then they would paint it. And after the cartoon would end, was the exact same size as the tapestry. Now they would then take the cartoon or painting, as it's called, and take it to the workshop. In this case, when the tapestries were woven for Pope Leo, the cartoons were sent to a workshop in Brussels. And Peter van Altz, who was the head of this workshop, supervised the weaving of the tapestries. And there would be sketches, outlines of the composition done, because they would hang the cartoons themselves near the weavers, and those would be guides for color. But then the forms that you see here that were cut into strips would be placed under the looms as a guide for the weavers. And this is a great picture of how that might have looked. And there's probably four or five or six weavers, usually, as far as I know, always men, weaving, and there might be as many as 15 or 18 looms. And so that's kind of a quick overview. There's a wonderful, maybe some of you already know this, there's a wonderful explanation and video of the weaving technique that's on the Victoria and Albert website. If you just Google Victoria and Albert Museum, Raphael tapestry video, it'll come right up, and it's really fascinating. You might want to take a look at that. So then the cartoons were created, and as I mentioned, the weavers wove from the back. So what resulted was an absolute mirror image of the cartoons, but the cartoons were exactly the same size as the tapestries. And the cartoons are now at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. We have reproductions in the exhibition. But here you see, the mirror images. And then the other thing that I mentioned, because these, not just Raphael, but most of the, well, probably all of the Renaissance artists, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, were very interested in antiquity and in very classical antique art, Roman and Greek. And you see that again and again in these tapestries. And that's why we have a number of copies of these ancient sculptures that relate so well to the tapestries. So here, for example, you see Tiber, which is a river god after a much earlier Greek sculpture. And then you see, oops, I'm going to get to dry this right. And then you see over here the very same position that this is actually Zebedee, which is the father of James, the apostles James and John. And again, Raphael was probably very much inspired by this particular sculpture, which was excavated in 1512, right before the time when he was making the cartoons and the tapestries would be woven. In this one, in the sculpture, there's a Romulus and Remus, who are the legendary founders of Rome. Let's see, they're down here as well. And another example is the Apollo Belvedere, which really contributed to a number of the positions of the saints, and especially Christ, as here you see in Christ's charge to, oops, keep doing that, to Peter. So again, we'll see this again in another of the tapestries. Oh yeah, and one more. So we have two copies by unknown artists of Gauls. One is the Dying Gaul and one is a Gaul in helmet. And here again, on the death of Ananias, which is the only tapestry, we don't have the actual tapestry, and it's kind of a mystery. This was supposedly part of the tapestries that went to the Mortlake manufactory when Charles I bought them in like 1623, but somehow this one is no longer available. So we do have a reproduction of it, but you can see how these figures in front relate to these two sculptures as well. So that whole idea of antiquities and of the how meaningful and how many of the artists of the Renaissance were looking back to that for inspiration is apparent in the tapestries. And the other thing I wanted to mention, I think is so fascinating. So all the other tapestries are independent. They're by themselves as stories, but these two really are companion pieces. And you can see that they have very similar backgrounds. They both take place around the Sea of Galilee. Um, the foregrounds are similar as well with the fauna or the flowers. And even to the point where there's a little boat, the tip of the boat in this one seems to be coming from over here. So these two, and they're also the only two that have Christ in them. And these come not from the Acts of Apostles, but from the Gospels, Matthew and Luke. So that it's just really interesting. And, they're so big that we unfortunately couldn't hang these two together, which would have been interesting. So you kind of have to, and we do have little picture or images that go with each one so you can see that yourselves. But on a slide, it's much easier to do. And now we're going to start to look at some of these other artists who were so interested and inspired by Raphael's work. And one of the most important is Marcantonio Raimondi. He was actually contemporary of Raphael. He worked at his studio, and he was a master printmaker who really was one of the first people to make engravings of fame, or not even famous, but of paintings, and help them become famous. So he's really responsible for spreading the fame of Raphael to a much bigger degree than it might have been without these. And so he, in this case, he would study these cartoons or the tapestries in this case very, very carefully. And at first glance, it looks like it's an absolute same pictures over here. But if you look closely at these up in the gallery, you'll notice there are differences. And what's a couple fascinating things about this one, for example, is he didn't sign his work, but he did leave us his signature in a way, because he put this little book in the corner so that we would know it was his. And the other really interesting thing is that he put in this particular print, this engraving, there are two figures on the balcony of this temple. And interestingly, they appear on this Maiolica tin glazeware, ceramic ware as well, which was very popular at the time. Maiolica was founded like in Iraq in the 9th century, but it became very popular during the Renaissance. And the fact that there are two figures in both these reproductions lets us know that there must have been another drawing that in which Raphael included them, but they are not included in either the cartoon or the tapestry. So that's kind of the kind of thing that's fun to look for in these prints. Another important contemporary of Raphael was Ugo da Capri, and he he developed this system of printing using wood blocks. And so you kind of see the colors here, each wood block. I think this one has 3 blocks, would be a different color. And they really kind of appear almost like watercolors, a very different kind of look. Again, if you start looking at these carefully, you'll see there are differences. For example, these swags in the background are very different from these over here. And, it's a different media. So it definitely comes off looking a lot different. And I believe that Da Capri signed his work as well over here. And then the etching on the left is from the School of Fontainebleau, which was a group of artists who worked in France. And there was a big printmaking workshop they also did painting, but they also made prints. And interestingly, towards the later Renaissance, the style of art artists started exploring and extending it. And there was a type of art called mannerism. And it really, it did some odd things because Renaissance art is so symmetrical and classical. It kind of played with that. And it often the style was elongated figures. But in this case, it's so interesting. So the main focus of this miraculous draft of the fishes, of course, is the fact that the fishermen are pulling in these fish, which Christ has just made available. And that's kind of the foreground. And back here, if you can't see it in this slide, but if you look in the tapestries, you'll see people, you'll see groups more like these people that are in the foreground of the print. So this particular printmaker actually switched those two around. It's called the Mannerist inversion. And he or she, probably he, put the focus of the whole composition in the background and had these kind of people in groups just talking in front. So again, and you can see a lot of other differences, added lots of waves in the scene, etc. But it's interesting that some of the artists tried to follow the tapestries just as closely as they could, and others infused them with their own ideas. And then Albert Dürer was a really important figure. He was, a German who was really credited with establishing printmaking as an independent form of art. He was also a painter, but his prints are quite wonderful, and he was a great admirer of Raphael. And in pieces like this, his the rejection of Joachim's sacrifice, which is a story, a New Testament story. Dürer did a series called The Life of the Virgin, and this is one of them. And this is the scene where Joachim and the parents of Mary aren't able to conceive a child. And at the time, that was believed as a mark that God was saying these aren't good people. And that's why they were rejecting their sacrifice at the temple. And of course, later on, the other part of the story is that, an angel came and of course, Mary did conceive. But this is the story that was, a prelude to that. But you can see that there are a number of similarities. For example, this little figure here is very similar to this one in the Healing of the Lame Man tapestry. And like Raphael, Dürer was very interested in architecture, and architecture often forms a very elaborate background in his prints, as is the case with Raphael as well. And then interestingly, Dürer had this habit of, we're not sure whether or not he went to Rome, and he probably saw a lot of work by Raphael, but we don't know if they ever met. But he had this habit of asking artists to trade work. And so Raphael actually sent him this print. This is not in the exhibition. And then Dürer wrote on the print, this is what he wrote about Raphael, who is so highly regarded by the Pope, and asserts that he has made this new drawing and sent it to Albert Dürer in Nuremberg in order to show his hand. And it is a drawing, it's a nude that later ends up in a painting, a fresco of the Battle of Ostia that is in the Vatican. So there's this wonderful relationship that certainly existed, although we're not sure whether they ever met in person or not. And then this is a print by Dürer from our collection. And it is a print that there has been so much ink spilled over this and so many essays and papers written about, because it's really so enigmatic. And some, so there's a figure over here. We're not sure if it's a man or a woman. Many think it could be a psychological self-portrait of Dürer himself, the artist. It could be the fact that, being an artist is so difficult, that sometimes you have a block, that sort of thing. And then there's this whole idea in it of things that are very rational. So there are all these tools, like carpenter's tools, hammers and nails. And then there's all these things that are more imaginative, such as there's a magic number square here. There's a rainbow. There's a ladder that seems to go nowhere. But it's as if this figure is just so stressed out that, in fact, she can't even feed he or she can't even feed the dog, who seems to be starving over here. So at any rate, it's a really interesting, it's not that large, but it's really interesting to look at this in detail and see all that's included. And then just one more word about Durer. So of course, he was a famous painter as well. He painted the scene you see on your left, this diptych of the four apostles. Now, interestingly, so Durer is lived in the north. He was during the time when Luther really put up his letters and rejected the Roman Catholicism and established Protestantism. And it became so the fact that that was happening is evident in this particular painting, because Peter is back here and he's placed in the back, while Paul is kind of the forward grounded figure. And the reason is that Paul talked a lot about the importance of the word. You know, Luther translated the Bible to German, and the idea was that anybody could read the Bible and hear the word of God, that you didn't need the Pope. So it became almost the art has some very it divides, and we'll even see that later when we talk about the set of Acts of Apostles tapestries that ended up in Dresden that we have here at the museum. And then on the right is a copy of Durer's work, but this artist, Georg Gartner, turned it into one panel. And copyists were came to the forefront during the Renaissance. And it was believed that if you were a good copyist, you were a good artist. And actually, by the time the art academies were established in Europe a bit later, copying was really an essential part of the curriculum. I think today we think of copying as being kind of like, we respect innovation and looking at the world in new ways a little bit more than just copying. But at the time it was highly regarded. And this is one of those artists who was a very fine copyist. And you see him here. His doesn't have the German at the bottom, as does Durer's. But otherwise, it's over life size, and it's really has a presence. I'm sure you've all seen it upstairs. And then this one is interesting. So there's all these, I don't know, 50 or 60 works that go with the tapestries, but there are no women represented in any of them except this printmaker, Diana Scultori. And the fact that we know her name is pretty amazing in itself. She was a wonderful printmaker, and she learned from her father. And she was also a really smart businesswoman, apparently. And she came to Rome, she got to Pope Leo, and she actually convinced him to bar anyone else from copying her prints. She also used her printmaking to further her husband's career in architecture. But here you see that she very much is an admirer of Raphael. And this one is Christ and the woman taken in adultery, which you see in the middle here. But of course, the columns are very reminiscent of those in the healing of the lame man over here. Very similar. And even the structure of these steps and the two figures are very much like the ones in the death of Ananias. And again, a lot of attention to architecture. And here you have a rounded temple, which you also have in Paul preaching at Athens, a round temple. So there's a lot of back and forth between these printmakers and the work of Raphael. She was also one of the first people to put inscriptions on her work that you see here. And then these are more examples that are in the exhibition of works that have been copied. So we have a copy of a Raphael work of Saint Cecilia. Saint Cecilia was the patron saint of music. She's holding a hand organ. She was also kind of into being very chaste, and was really this particular composition has broken instruments on the bottom. as a way of kind of really valuing the work of heaven and of prayer and so forth over the material things of life. I think it's interesting too here that all these figures, none of them have sandals on except her. I don't know if that has any particular meaning or not. But here's the Raphael, and they look very different in color. It's only because those are the images I happened to find. They probably weren't that far apart. And then the image on the right is a wonderful Madonna of the Chair. This is actually supposedly the most copied work from the Renaissance, and it is quite beautiful. It's, of course, of a very believable mother and child. It could represent anybody's mother and child. And the woman is dressed in Florentine Renaissance fabrics and scarf and a shawl. She's very approachable, but it's also the way Raphael has depicted them. It's almost like you're looking up at them in a pose of adoration. And again, it's very hard to tell the original from the copy. Another example in the exhibition is the Isaiah by an Italian artist, Casanova. Again, the color differentiation is probably not this stark. This is the original. It just happens to be the ones that I was able to get. But it's really very identical, Casanova's to Raphael's. And again, Raphael was looking at Michelangelo. And that one you can see, I think, a very distinct difference. The image of Isaiah, this is Isaiah the prophet, and he looks very different in this view as from Raphael's, almost feminine over here with the colors and the lack of beard. But the thing that's the same are the putti that you see. There's two here, and Raphael has included those as well. This is from a fresco on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And the Casanova is from Dresden. But it's interesting that copying has not gone out of style. So there's still, this is a master class at the Louvre of most major museums, including like the National Gallery and the Met, allow people to go in and copy works of art. And people have certainly done the same thing here at the Columbus Museum of Art. Often they have to make a reservation and it's a long period of waiting, but it's a technique, it's a course of, art education that still goes on today. And then, so the things we looked at were done more contemporaneously with Raphael when he was alive or shortly after he died. Now we're going to move on to the 17th century. And what's important here, of course, is that is when Charles I, who you see over here in this wonderful portrait by Anthony van Dyck, he previously had established the Mortlake Manufactory in London to really rival those in France and the one in Brussels, because these tapestries were so very popular. The tapestries, they all tell a story, and it could be religious, it could be political. There is some sense that they also helped, insulate cold palaces and country estates. But the thing that is really important is that they represented status, and anybody that was wealthy or was related to royalty or religious wise in the church, like the papacy, these tapestries were a must for a collection. And so they really attested to the kind of the status of the person who commissioned it. But Anthony van Dyck did these wonderful portraits of Charles I and his wife Henrietta. Charles was under 5 feet. I don't think he was a very kingly looking person, but Van Dyck became his royal court painter, and he did his best. He probably did about 40 paintings of Charles I and always made him look quite quite regal. Van Dyck was a Baroque painter who just really had a wonderful sense of depicting fabrics like satin and lace and pearls that just have this wonderful sheen to them. Unfortunately, Charles I believed in the divine right of kings, which ultimately led to a civil war, and he was ultimately beheaded. His wife went to France, but she came back when the monarchy was restored, and her son, Charles II, was king. So there, and interestingly, she has these flowers in front of her stomach, and we think perhaps it's indicating that she was pregnant. And we also have a wonderful Van Dyck, Christina Bruce, Countess of Devonshire, in our collection, and it's in the 31 building. It's on view right now. So the fact that Charles brought the cartoons to London were really, really important for many artists. They inspired many artists, and especially these printmakers. They weren't on view until the end of the 17th century, so it took a while. They were eventually put at Hampton Court, and people could come and see them. And one of the people that saw prints, probably Rembrandt, from the Netherlands, really never made the grand tours many of the artists did then, and went to Italy, but he would have seen Raphael's work in the prints. And he also talked about going to an auction where he saw a painting of Raphael's that greatly affected him. So we know that there was certainly a connection between the two artists. And here you see the tribute money, which is Christ is here in the middle. But again, you can kind of see consistencies between the robes and the presentation. Rembrandt, like Raphael, was very interested in gestures and in facial expressions to really communicate what his figures were thinking. And you see that in his work as well as Raphael's, and also that attention to architecture is very similar. But here, the figure of Christ has been compared to the proconsul in the blind of Elymas, and you see his hand up, etc. So there are those connections as well. And then Poussin, Nicolas Poussin, was an important French artist who became known as Raphael of the French. He greatly admired Raphael, did go on the grand tour, spent time in Rome, probably might have seen the tapestries, and saw again many of other works by Raphael. And this was still the kind of the Baroque period, but he was much more of a classical artist in the same sense as Raphael, with interested in balance and not, trying to eliminate unnecessary detail. So here you have an adoration of the Magi, which again suggests the architecture that we see in the same adoration, or in the same subject that Raphael did, of the adoration of the Magi. And again, the similarities between the Madonna and Child that you see over here. Interestingly, Raphael, as I mentioned, was very kind of gregarious, worked with all these artists and printmakers in a studio. And Poussin was very kind of a quiet individual who worked on an easel. In fact, he gave up doing grander commissions for churches because he was just more comfortable working in a very different way, but greatly admired the work of Raphael nevertheless. And then Peter Paul Rubens was a very important Flemish master of Baroque art, and he too was a great admirer of Raphael. And it's thought, in fact, that he became a painter, a history painter for Charles I in London, and some scholars believe he actually encouraged Charles I to buy the cartoons. But here, this is such an interesting piece. So Rubens was commissioned by the court in the Netherlands to do a set of tapestries, 20 tapestries on the miracle of the Eucharist. And he never got around to doing the tapestries, but he did this modella. It was a smaller painting that's up in the exhibition of one of the pieces. And his idea was that 11 of the 20 were going to be in this style, this kind of trompe l'oeil style. You see, this is kind of an illusion within an illusion. So here's the tapestry, and you can see the little putti are holding it up, but it's kind of like a backdrop. And then you see the architecture of the scene behind it. And in the Baroque fashion and Rubens fashion, every corner is filled. There's putti and garlands and swaths of fabric. And then the figures themselves are very in dramatic poses here with lots of swirling garments and really very rich colors as well. And again, Rubens was looking at the figures from Raphael's Acts of the Apostles as well, with especially you see it in the robes and in the gestures. So here you have Abraham, who's dressed in war armor, and he's talking to, or he's being given a presence with the king and the priest of Jerusalem, Melchizedek. I just can't say this word right. Melchizedek, exactly. And this is an Old Testament story from the Hebrew Bible, but of course, Christians believe that this is a foretelling of the Last Supper. And you see the priest handing him the bread here. But again, you can pick out figures that really, I think, relate to what's going on over here. It's hard for me to see. But you see lots of similarities. And in fact, even the priest kind of looks like a Peter type figure. And what's interesting is this figure over here, and he's looking at us as if he's got something to tell us that's really important. I'm not sure what it is exactly. And again, you see the architecture is repeated in the columns that you see in much of Raphael's work as well. And then I just threw this in. These are not in the exhibition, but this is if I didn't have the credit lines underneath, I'm sure each of you could tell which was the Raphael and which was the Rubens, because it tells you in a heartbeat how Rubens filled his canvas with all kinds of cloth and garlands and putti. Everything is covered, whereas Raphael's is very plain and very kind of, not a lot of movement going on here. Equally, Rubens, was known for kind of his fleshy women. He loved doing nudes. Raphael's are much more restrained. Perhaps they're younger. They're not really interacting with one another as they are over here. So it's just in a very quick way, you can see the difference between these two, even though Rubens really respected and often emulated Raphael in his work. And then this is an Italian artist, Savastino Ricci. And this is interesting too. He's, again, a great admirer of Raphael. In his piece, which is the sacrifice to Silenus. Silenus was a Bacchus-like god, and he was kind of he drank a lot. He was overweight. He was kind of boisterous. And you see him here, and he's on an altar, and people are bringing sacrifices to him. It's really just a scene of pagan mythology. But you see the similarities to some of the figures, for example, here to the figure in the sacrifice at Lystra. Even the altar kind of setup is similar. And again, the interest in the architecture, which you see here in the background. But this was, again, an offshoot of the Baroque style, which became known as Rococo. Again, the palette of these artists were often lighter. You see some of that happening here in the sky, but also this very elongated figure. and some kind of strange twisted positions. So it was kind of another offshoot of the Baroque style, but it was a bit different. And then Diziani was a student of Ricci's, of the last artist. He did a lot of theatrical backdrops, which I think you kind of can feel here. Again, very bright, rich colors, but again, paying homage to Raphael and the fact of the architecture in the background, the expressions on the faces of the figures. This is a scene from the Hebrew Bible, and Moses turns Aaron's staff into a snake. And here you see the Pharaoh in his kind of gesture of horror of the snake, similar somewhat to the proconsul over here. Again, a lot of the same interest in the architecture and in the robes and gestures of the figures here. And this Nicolas Dorigny was a Frenchman who actually was studying to become a lawyer, but he had some problems with hearing, and he started doing printmaking, and he became a really well-known printmaker who did this for many, many decades. And he was requested by Queen Anne to come to London and to actually do a series of prints on the from the tapestries, actually from the cartoons. That's why I have the cartoon over here that had come to London with Charles I in the early part of the 17th century. But at this point, they were available. And so Dorigny was the first person to really make a set of prints directly from the cartoons, and they became very popular. Artists, you know, we'll see in a moment that even some American artists who went to London were very greatly influenced by these prints that they would see of the cartoons. What else can I tell you about that? And then, as I mentioned, so there were two artists that were known as the American Raphael, both Benjamin West and John Singleton Copley. So both these artists left America before the Revolutionary War. They went to England, and neither one of them ever came back. And they became very well known in London. Benjamin West was a portrait painter, but he started painting history pictures in London as well. And this is his scene of Hannah presenting her son Samuel to the high priest. And it's a really interesting painting because Hannah was finding it difficult to conceive, and she promised God that if she did, and if she had a son, she would give him to the temple and to serve God. And so she did have a son, and she brought him to Eli the high priest, who you see with his breastplate of the 12 tribes with stones in them. And she is presenting her son. Samuel turned out to be a great leader. He was responsible for establishing the kingship, the monarchy in Israel. So he's a very, very important figure. The cows back here, you know, possibly represent sacrifice that Hannah's having to live through about giving her son up. But of course, Christians interpreted this as kind of a foretelling of the coming of Christ. So that's kind of an important story in Christian thought as well. But here again, you see in the positions here of the child some connection to the tapestries that West would have been familiar with. He in turn, so he came to England around, I think, I want to say 1763. He then he knew John Singleton Copley, and he urged him to come to London, which he did. And unfortunately, we don't have Watson the Shark which is at the National Gallery in Washington. But we do have this Valentine Green print. And what's important here, so this is an event, you might be familiar with this painting, it's quite famous. There was an event where a young boy, Brooke Watson, was 14 years old. He fell out of a boat off the coast of Havana, Cuba, and he was bitten by a shark. And this is that event. And then many years later, he survived with just, they might have had to amputate part of his foot, but he ended up years later being the mayor of London and becoming quite wealthy. And he commissioned Copley to document this scene. And what's often noted is that the figures trying to save young Watson here really resemble the fishermen pulling in the catch, as they did in the miraculous draft of the fishes. And then similarly, this figure of Brooke Watson is akin to the Apollo Belvedere that was so influential in Raphael's work as well. So there are a lot of similarities. And in fact, Copley talked about this because, you know, this was actually the first history painting that Copley did. And he knew that it had to have some weight to it. So by connecting it to this religious scene, it made it have more weight than it would have if it was just, you know, the incident of a shark attack on its own. So it made it much more important and acceptable in some circles, at least. And the print is quite wonderful. It's a mezzotint, which this particular printmaker really worked hard at developing. And it's a beautiful technique in which you can get lots of shades of color, of black and white, and so, really express shadows. And it's almost has a velvet texture to it. Oops. And then interestingly, from our collection is this wonderful painting by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And it's called La Fornerina, or Raphael and the Baker's Daughter. So Raphael had a long-term relationship with this woman. And this is actually a painting that Raphael did of her, not in the exhibition, but right before he died, actually. And she was known as La Fornerina because it means the baker's daughter. And in Ingres' painting, you see Raphael looking longingly at his own painting that he is doing of Margherita Luti was her name, of this woman. She's kind of holding him in a very loving way, but he seems more interested with his painting. It's almost as if he had to choose between the two, he would take art over his lover. In the background, you see the last painting that he worked on, the Transfiguration, which is over here, and he never really finished it. It's quite a wonderful work, but it's in the background here, as well as Michelangelo, who's over here in the corner. It's a wonderful piece, and Ingres did a number of different versions of this, and we're very fortunate to have this one, and it's up in the exhibition. Ingres was very much interested in classical art, and he was a neoclassicist. He revived it. He was very impressed with Raphael's kind of restraint and symmetry and really classical approach to painting. And then I have a few that are not in the exhibition. I wish they were, but they're to make the point that Raphael's influence continues to go on and to be really important. You're all probably familiar with Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Well, he was very much looking at a print. Again, this is by Marcantonio Raimondi, the same person who worked in Raphael's studio, was a contemporary of Raphael. And this is The Judgment of Paris, which Manet is actually kind of poking fun at, and kind of was saying, well, it was just really an excuse to depict nudes, because there's a lot of them over here. And he kind of did the same thing and made this painting that was very controversial at the time. It wasn't accepted by the Salon. And it's actually a painting that was in the Salon des Refusés, which was the beginning of Impressionism in Paris at the end of the 19th century. And then another example is De Chirico, who was a surrealist artist. This one was done in 1913, but he very much was looking at Raphael's architecture, and especially in this particular, the Marriage of the Virgin, which has such clean lines and forms, and you see it reflected here. So De Chirico used these architectural passages and put them together in a very enigmatic way with lots of shadows and hard lines. But again, you can see the connection between the two. Oh no, I have two more examples. And then Guernica by Picasso. Picasso too was an admirer of Raphael. A little harder to equate, but yet, you know, this is, Guernica was a protest against the fascist bombing of Guernica in Spain. And again, it's depicting the chaos that ensued, but he was looking at Raphael's work, Fire in the Borgo, which you see up here, a similar figure to this figure of a woman and child. Over here, you see flames again. Again, it's the chaos of, in this case, the fire. It was an event that happened in 1827, I believe. There was a fire in this building very close to the Vatican. And again, like Raphael, Picasso intersperses architectural elements, and the gestures are very, you know, abstracted and kind of cubist, but nonetheless, they're very akin to the same kinds of gestures that were so important in the work of Raphael and that you see here. And then I do have one more, which is Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol was raised in a very kind of religious Catholic upbringing. He's really, you know, this is a kind of example of pop art where he's taking this image from Raphael's Sistine Madonna and creating like a coloring book kind of thing that might be $6.99. It's not disrespectful exactly, but it's kind of using everyday objects to represent other ideas. And some critics actually called him the Pope of Pop, which I think is kind of funny. And I'm sure there are other examples that are of the 21st century. I couldn't find any good ones, but I'm sure they're there because Raphael's stature, certainly it's not the same as it was in the centuries previous to ours, but still an extremely important master that artists continue to look back on, respect, and emulate. And this is a quote, in a 20-year career, Raphael revolutionized Western art and its impact, and his impact was felt for hundreds of years, arguably shaping the European tradition more than any other artist before or since. This is from a new book on Raphael that was written by these two, David Eskergian and Tom Henry. But again, there's been a lot of commentary and books written about Raphael because we just celebrated the 500th year since his death would have been in 2020. And of course, because of COVID, a lot of the exhibitions that were put together for that reason were delayed. In fact, our own exhibition is a good example, was supposed to happen way before 2022. But I think the point being that Raphael, you know, I think Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci are kind of household names, and maybe Raphael is not quite as familiar, but I think probably just as important and just as much of a genius as the other two that we seem to know the names of more. But that's where I'd like to stop. And if you have any questions, I'm happy, or comments, I'd be happy to hear them. So thank you. Could we have the lights on, please, Jacob? Thank you. Any questions or comments? It's so nice to see you all. Couldn't for a while there. Anything? Uh-huh. I don't think we know for sure. I'm not sure we know for sure that that is Michelangelo, but that's most of the commentary. I think it's because he, Angeret considered him in the same, Raphael is in the same category as Michelangelo, would be my guess, but you can have your own interpretation. Anything else? Well, thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of the day and go up in the exhibition, look at some of those details. And it's really fun to take your time and look.